Welcome everybody to this course in International Monetary Economics. So we are in chapter 13, which is the introductory chapter for this part of the textbook. And the overall topic is national income accounting and the balance of payment. So it is an introductory chapter where we try to clarify some terms. So in the first step, I would like to talk about the difference between GDP and GNP. GDP measures the production within one economy, but GDP does not measure the income which is available to the domestic population. The domestic income is labeled as gross national product, GNP, and the difference between GNP and GDP stems from the transactions with the outside world. So one person who lives in Germany but works, for example, in Poland, receives a factor income, a wage from abroad. So this person is living in Germany, working in Poland, so he is paid by a Polish company. This person increases the Polish GDP, but the German GNP. Furthermore, it might be the case that there's a person living in Germany and he has saved some money in form of stocks or bonds, and therefore this person is receiving factor income in form of interest or dividend, and therefore it will be the case that the German GNP increases, the German income increases in case that this person receives interest and dividend from abroad. For many countries, it is more or less, there is no difference between GDP and GNP. But for some countries, this distinction is important. In the next slide, you can see a figure, 3 different countries over time. There is a black line, which is represents the situation in Kuwait, red Ireland, and the light red line, this is Germany. Here you can see the ratio GDP over GNP. The ratio is almost equal to 1 for Germany, so there is more or less no difference between GDP and GNP. But in Ireland, it's a case that GDP is higher than GNP, therefore this ratio is larger than 1, and for Kuwait, this ratio is smaller than 1. In Ireland, it is a case that a lot of foreign companies have invested in Ireland. So production in Ireland is relatively high, but to some extent this is transferred back to the different countries so that the GNP in Ireland is smaller than the GDP. In Kuwait, it is a case that this country was running current account surpluses due to oil exports. Therefore, this country is receiving a lot of factor income from abroad so that the GNP is higher than the GDP. Production is lower than the income. Kuwait receives or has a higher income compared to the production which is going on in Kuwait. This black line increased tremendously in the beginning of the 1990s. This is due to the Gulf War, where Kuwait had to pay for some of the costs of this war, and therefore the amount of stocks and bonds decreased, and hence also the GNP of Kuwait decreased in this time period. So for a lot of countries, this relationship is equal to 1, and therefore this distinction doesn't matter. For some countries, this distinction is important. I think more or less in this lecture, this distinction will not be so important at all. Let's have a look at the composition of the German GDP in the year 2005. You can see here the different components: consumption, investment, government spending, and then the term in brackets. This is like the current account balance net exports, so the difference between exports and imports. When you look at the share in the last column, then it's the case that 60% goes to the private consumption, it goes to C, then about 19% this is government expenditure, 17% this is domestic investment. So the domestic usage of goods, which is the sum of C, I, and G, is equal to 95%. Then Germany is also running a current account balance, and this was equal to 5% in the year 2005. So more or less, it is the case that Germany is producing 100 goods, but the domestic usage of goods is only equal to 95. So 5 goods are given away to the outside world. We can also make it a little bit more realistic and say, like Germany is producing 100 cars, 90 cars are used within the economy and 10 cars are exported to the outside world. Then we are also importing olives, we are importing ouzo, and we are importing some tourist services from Greece. Let's assume that this has a value of 5, so Germany is exporting 10 cars to Greece and is importing 5 units from Greece, so that the current account balance with Greece is equal to 5. Germany is producing 100 goods, only 95 are used within Germany, and 5 goods are given to the outside world. The big question is, what does Germany get for these 5% of goods? What does Germany get for this current account balance? This is a very important question.
It is the case that Germany is producing 100 goods and is only consuming the value of 95 goods. So Germany has a current account surplus. And the big question was, what does Germany get in exchange? And we already started to talk about the relationship Germany versus Greece. So let's assume that there are only these two countries, Germany and Greece, which are out there, and Germany is running a current account surplus, while Greece is running a current account deficit. So what does Germany get in exchange? So Germany is like asking Greece, do you want to buy that? Do you want to buy this very nice car? Yes, the Greeks say. It's a very nice car and we want to buy it. Then the German ask, can you pay? And the Greeks say, no, we can't. Therefore, the Greeks are writing like a government bond, 100 euro in the year 2005. Let's say like a 5% interest and a nice signature. So this is what the Germans get in exchange, like a government bond of Greece. It says 100 euros, a 5% interest rate, and a nice signature. So how does this relationship look like in 2006? It looks the same. Once more, the Germans are visiting Greece. Bzzz. Do you want to buy this nice car? Yes, the Greeks say. The Germans ask, can you pay? No, the Greeks say, we can't. So once more, the Greeks are writing like a government bond of 100 euro. And the interest rate is 5%. It's the year 2006 and you get a nice signature. So once more, the Germans, they get this very nice bond, like a Greek government bond, 100 euros, 5% interest, and it's the year 2006 and a nice signature. So the Germans are going back and they are piling up like these bonds in the cellar of the financial system, and they realize, oh, there's already one bond from 2005, and now the interest is due. And we ask the Greeks, can you pay like the €5 interest? And they say no. So in the year 2006, Greek has to write a bond for like €105 and not €100, because we also have to pay the interest. So the Germans, they are glad. So they are applauding, and they get more and more Greek bonds. So they are piling up a lot of Greek bonds. And in 2007 the same, and so on. But suddenly it becomes clear that the Greeks can't pay back. So what do we do with all these Greek bonds? We are destroying these Greek bonds, and afterwards we are throwing them back to like the garbage bin. So this is where the Greek bonds end up. And hence, I would say that this relationship doesn't make sense. Like a current account surplus forever doesn't make sense. This problem is not solved right now. So when you look at this relationship in the year 2020, it's a case that Germany is still running a tremendous current account surplus. So Germany is piling up a lot of bonds, and this problem, which was there in 2005, is not solved at all.
In subchapter 13.2, we once more talk about the relationship between saving and investment, and now another feature is the current account balance. Like in a closed economy, it was a case that saving of the society has to be equal to investment. But this relationship must not hold anymore because of the fact that a country can borrow from abroad or lend to the outside world in case that we talk about the open economy. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the goods market equilibrium condition in an open economy. One possibility to quote the equilibrium condition for the goods market in the closed economy was that investment is equal to saving. But in an open economy, the open economy can use the international financial markets to borrow or lend to foreigners. One possibility to quote the equilibrium condition for the goods market in the open economy is to look at this relationship where we have goods supply on the left-hand side and goods demand on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, we once more have the relationship consumption, investment, government spending, then exports, and minus the imports. In front of the variable which measures imports, there is an epsilon, and epsilon, it represents the real exchange rate. And the following numerical example highlights why it is so important to have the real exchange rate in front of the import units. So let's assume that the domestic economy is producing wheat and the foreign economy is producing milk. The output in the domestic economy is equal to 100 units of wheat. Then consumption is equal to the value of 75 units of wheat. But you can see that there's a little index A above this variable which represents consumption. Actually, it is the case that the private households are consuming only 55 units of wheat, and the consumption is and the private households are also consuming 40 units of milk. So actually, it's a case that the private households are consuming 55 units of wheat, 40 units of milk. So we have to make the milk units and the wheat units comparable, and therefore we need the real exchange rate. And here the real exchange rate is equal to 0.5 units of wheat for 1 unit of milk. So the 40 milk units the private households are consuming, they have the same value as 20 units of wheat. Therefore, the value of consumption is equal to 75 units of wheat. It seems to be the case that investment is equal to 25 units of wheat, government spending is equal to 10 units of wheat, exports are also equal to 10 units of wheat, and imports are equal to the value of 20 units of wheat. But of course, we are not importing wheat because this is the domestic good. Actually, we are importing these 40 units of milk. You can see that there is a little index B above the variable which represents the import units, so that the 40 units of milk, they have the value of 20 units of wheat. So we need the real exchange rate to make the import units to normalize the import units so that we can compare the import units, the value of the import units in the value of the domestic good in units of wheat. So please be reminded that when we use this relationship here, that we always talk about real good units, and we use the domestic good in order to measure the value of consumption, investment, government spending, exports, and the imports. Since we are importing the foreign good, we need the real exchange rate to make the import units comparable to the domestic good units. Let's directly start here a little excursus with respect to the real exchange rate. How do we get to the value of the real exchange rate? In the next example, we assume that Europe produces only potatoes and the US produces only steaks. So the price for the domestic good potato is equal to 4 euros per potato. The price for a steak is P star is equal to $2 for steak. We frequently use this little star, like this asterisk, to symbolize foreign units. So the foreign price level is given by P star. The nominal foreign exchange rate is given by 1 euro for $1. The real exchange rate is defined as nominal exchange rate times the foreign price level divided by the domestic price level. So when we plug in the numbers we have, when we plug in the nominal exchange rate of 1 euro per dollar times the foreign price level, $2 per steak, divided by 4 euros per potato, then we get the real exchange rate. In the first step, it is the case that this dollar sign cancels out in the numerator of this fraction. So the numerator of this fraction becomes like 2 euros per steak. And then it is the case that we can also cancel the 2 and the 4. We get 1/2. And the euro signs will also cancel out, so that in the end, the real exchange rate has a dimension like half a potato for 1 steak. So the real exchange rate measures the price of 1 foreign good in terms of a domestic good. So 1 American exchanges 1 steak for 0.5 potatoes, or when you want to put it the other way around, a European exchanges 1 potato for 2 steaks. But the real exchange rate, as we measured it, it is the price of 1 unit of the foreign good measured in units of the domestic good. So the real exchange rate is given by the ratio nominal exchange rate times the foreign price level divided by the domestic price level. Several times we want to work with the natural log of the real exchange rate. So in case that we take the natural log of this relationship, we get the natural log of the real exchange rate is equal to the natural log of the nominal exchange rate plus the natural log of the foreign price level minus the natural log of the domestic price level. Frequently we want to abbreviate this relationship, and we don't always want to write natural log because this will give us very, very long expressions. Therefore, we want to use small letters to display the natural log of a variable. So we define the natural log of a large E is symbolized by a small letter e. Therefore, the natural log of the real exchange rate is equal to the natural log of the nominal exchange rate plus the natural log of the foreign price level minus the natural log of the domestic price level. This is so far the excursus related to the real exchange rate. In the next part of the lecture, I would like to derive a relationship which looks a little bit like this relationship: investment is equal to savings. Like you know already that we can formulate the goods market equilibrium condition in two ways. In the closed economy, it was a case that one possibility is to say goods supply is equal to goods demand. And there we talked about Y on the left-hand side and consumption, investment, government spending on the right-hand side. Another possibility to quote the equilibrium condition for the goods market in a closed economy is that saving has to be equal to investment. But this relationship, of course, will change in the open economy. And in the following step, I would like to derive this investment is equal to saving relationship for an open economy. We once more start in the first equation with the normal goods market equilibrium condition you are already familiar with. Left-hand side, goods supply. Right-hand side is goods demand. When we subtract C and T from both sides of the equation, we get to this relationship here, minus C minus T on the left-hand side. And there was already a C on the right-hand side of the equation. This will cancel out against this C when we subtract. And then we have a minus T left on the right-hand side of this relationship. Private saving is defined as gross income. Then we have to pay taxes. We subtract the taxes. Then we go shopping and we subtract consumption, so that private saving is defined as gross income minus the taxes minus consumption. This term here is private savings. So you can see that private savings is already given on the left-hand side of equation 2. So we can insert private savings on the left-hand side. The current account balance is defined as exports minus imports, so that we can insert the current account balance on the right-hand side of the equation, so that we get to the second last equation. Private saving is equal to investment plus government spending minus the taxes plus the current account balance. Now we want to solve this relationship for the current account balance. We want to isolate the current account balance on one hand side of the equation. So we have to subtract I, we have to subtract G, and we have to add T. When we do that, when we put I on the other hand side of the equation, it pops up here with a negative sign. G on the other hand side of the equation pops up with a negative sign, and T on the other hand side of the equation pops up with a positive sign. So when we solve this relationship for CA, we get that the current account balance is equal to private savings plus savings of the government minus investment. So in case that national savings is larger than investment, then this country is running a current account surplus. So for example, one country which is running a current account surplus, this is Germany. Also China. China is also running a current account surplus because of the fact especially that private savings is very, very high in China. If, however, investment is larger than national savings, then the country is running a current account deficit. So one country which has very low private savings and where also the savings of the government is in red ink, this is the US. Like the US is always running a government budget deficit, so T minus G, taxes minus government spending. The government budget is in red ink, and also the Americans, they are not saving too much. Hence, the Americans, the US is one good example for a country which has a current account deficit. Frequently in macroeconomics, we want to find out what happens if, for example, a shock arrives and investment increases. This could either lead to a situation where private savings is up or government savings is up, or where the current account balance will deteriorate. Or we want to find out what happens if government spending increases. So what happens if the government increases government spending and performs an expansionary fiscal policy? This could lead to a situation where private savings increases, investment decreases, or the current account balance will deteriorate. For example, in a closed economy, we already know what happens in the ISLM world in case that government increases government spending. It is the case that the government increases government spending. This leads to an increase in GDP, but also the interest rate increases. So there is an interest rate induced crowding out effect. Investment is lower. Investment will decrease because of this interest rate induced crowding out effect. Furthermore, when the economy ends up in a boom and GDP is higher, then also private savings will increase, private savings will be higher. But in an open economy, there's a third possibility that also the current account balance will be affected and the current account balance could deteriorate. This equation, which we derived so far, does not tell anything about what will happen. To answer this question, what happens if one of these variables changes, what happens to this relationship? In order to answer this question, we need a fully fledged macroeconomic model, and these kind of models will be derived later on in chapter 15 or in chapter 15 and in chapter 17, 18 of this textbook. So this relationship is just introduced here in the introductory chapter, and we will go back to this relationship later on. So a country with a high saving rate has either a high level of private investment or a surplus in the current account. We mentioned already one country with a very high saving rate. This is China, and it has a surplus in the current account. And one country with a very low saving rate, this is the US. And in case that a country has a low saving rate, it either has a low level of private investment or a large deficit in the current account. So one example would be the US. In the next slide, you can see private savings, investment, the government budget and the current account balance of the US as a percent of GDP over time. So there are three different lines. One line represents the difference between private savings and investment. One curve represents the relationship between taxes minus government spending, so the government budget. And the black line here represents the current account balance. So it is in German, this abbreviation LB for Leistungsbilanz, but the black line here represents the current account balance. So what can we see in this graph? One important relationship is that the US was more or less always running a government budget deficit. So this light red line here is always below this line. So the government budget is running a deficit. And also the American current account is, since the 1980s, always in red ink. The Americans are always running a current account deficit. Since the government budget is in a deficit and the current account is in a deficit, we call this relationship like a twin deficit. What is also striking is there seems to be a negative correlation between savings and investment and the government budget. So for example, here in this time period, it is a case that S minus E goes up and T minus G goes down. So 74, something like that, 74, 75. Okay, there's an oil price shock. Then once more here in the beginning of the 80s, also S minus I is going up and T minus G is going down. Then also here, like after the bursting of the .com bubble, it is the case that T minus G is going down and S minus I is going up. So it seems to be the case that in a recession, S minus I is going up and T minus G is going down. So it seems to be the case that the business cycle is driving this relationship. In a recession, investment is decreasing, and when investment is decreasing, then S minus I is going up. Also, in a recession, tax revenues are decreasing, government spending is increasing, therefore the government budget deteriorates, and T minus G is decreasing in a recession. So we can see some relationships here, like one relationship is this twin deficit, T minus G in red ink and current account balance, and we can clearly see that the business cycle is driving these relationships. In the next part, I would like to briefly talk about the balance of payment. We talk about the balance of payment and several sub-balances. So the balance of payment can be divided into the current account, the capital account, the financial account in the broader sense, and some errors and omissions. The current account is subdivided into a goods account, an account for services, an account for primary income, and an account for secondary income. So when we are exporting or the economy is importing goods, then of course the first sub-account of the current account will be addressed. In case that the economy is exporting or importing services, the second sub-account of the current account will be addressed. The third sub-account, primary income, will be addressed in case that one domestic person is holding stocks or bonds from abroad and is receiving factor income in form of dividends or interest from abroad. Also, when one company is indebted to the outside world and this company is paying interest, then the primary income account will be addressed. This primary income account will also be addressed in case that there is one person living in Germany, working in Poland, and this person receives his wage rate from abroad. Then account number 3 will be addressed. So account number 3 will be addressed for wages when international transactions are performed, and interest and dividend payments. The secondary income account will only be addressed when the following incidents happen. Let's assume that there is a Turkish family or a family with Turkish roots living in Berlin, and each month the daddy of this family is sending 100 euros back home to the grandparents in Turkey. Since this payment occurs on a monthly basis, like every month the father is sending some money back home to the grandparents, then this secondary income account will be addressed. So it's not a market transaction, it's a kind of gift, and therefore we are distinguishing primary income, which is a market transaction, and secondary income, which is more like a gift. Capital account. The capital account is not that important. For example, the following incidents will be addressed in the capital account. Let's assume that this father with a Turkish background dies, and all his belongings are transferred back to Turkey. Then the capital account will be addressed. The capital account will be used in case a transaction happens, which only can occur once. For example, when somebody dies and the endowment goes back to the home country. Then the capital account will be addressed because it's a one-time transaction and it doesn't occur on a regular basis. Transactions which occur on a regular basis, they are addressed in the secondary income account. Then what is important is the financial account. The financial account in the broader sense can be subdivided in the financial account in the narrower sense, which is abbreviated by FA, and then reserve assets. The financial account in the narrower sense, they are performed by private agents, so by private households or private companies, in case that they perform direct investment, portfolio investment, financial derivatives, or other investments. The financial account in the narrower sense will be used. The reserve assets, which gets the abbreviation ORT, Official Reserve Transactions, this account will be addressed in case that the central bank intervenes at the foreign exchange market. So the central bank might sell or buy foreign currency in order to stabilize the exchange rate. And when the central bank intervenes, the official reserve transaction change, and then we address this reserve asset account. So the big difference between the financial account in the narrower sense and the reserve assets is financial account in the narrower sense will be addressed in case that private agents are performing a financial transaction, and the reserve asset account is addressed in case that the central bank is changing these kind of financial assets by performing an intervention at the foreign exchange market. So this reserve asset account will become very important in case that we talk about fixed exchange rate systems. So in chapter 18, we'll talk about fixed exchange rate systems, and there central bank intervention will be a central role when it comes to stabilizing the exchange rate. Then another account is errors and omissions. So in the end, it should be the case that the balance of payments is balanced. A lot of different institutions in one economy, they are giving some information to statistical offices or the central bank, which are recording these international transactions in goods, services, or financial transactions. In case that in the end the balance of payment is not balanced, then the account errors and omissions will be addressed. So in the real world, errors and omission might be an important account, but here in this lecture, this account will be irrelevant. We will not talk about errors and omissions anymore. So what is very important in this lecture is the current account and its sub-accounts. Then the financial account will be important, financial account in the narrow sense. And then the reserve assets account will be important in case that we talk about fixed exchange rate system and the central bank intervenes in the foreign exchange market. The balance of payment is an identity. This implies that this relationship current account balance is equal to financial account balance plus the official reserve transactions. This equation will always hold. Sometimes in older textbooks, this relationship is written a little bit different. So please be aware of the fact that there are two different versions how to quote this identity. But why are macroeconomists studying the balance of payment so intensively when this relationship always holds? Macroeconomists, they are studying the balance of payment because there are different combinations which will fulfill this identity. For example, it could be the case that the current account is in red ink, there is a current account deficit, and also the sum of the financial account and the official reserve transactions, they are also in deficit. So then a current account deficit is financed by getting more and more indebted to the rest of the world. One example is the US has a current account deficit, and the US is printing more government bonds and is paying the rest of the world with American bonds. So America is getting more and more indebted to the rest of the world, especially China. One example for a country which has a current account surplus and also financial account plus the official reserve transaction is positive. Of course, this is China. Like China has a current account surplus and the economy is accumulating foreign assets. So China is piling up foreign bonds. China is especially piling up American bonds. And this relationship also holds for China, but the signs, they have the opposite direction compared to the US. This balance of payment relationship is closely linked to an equilibrium on the foreign exchange market. Because when you use this accounting method where you use a T account, you could try to use a T account and book all the transactions which occur with the outside world on this kind of T account. Then transactions which lead to an inflow of foreign exchange, they are booked on the left-hand side of the balance of payment. They are booked on the left-hand side of this T account, and this will lead to a supply of foreign currency. On the right-hand side of this T account balance of payment, we would book items which result in an outflow of foreign exchange. So which result in an increase in the demand of foreign currency. And in case that the current account balance is equal to the financial account balance, then the demand on the foreign exchange market is equal to the supply of the foreign exchange market without any interventions of the central bank. And when demand is equal to supply, the foreign exchange market is in an equilibrium, the exchange rate does not change, and therefore exports and imports are not influenced by a change in the exchange rate. In case that this relationship does not hold, it would be the case that, for example, demand is larger than supply. It would have an effect on the exchange rate, and this change in the exchange rate would once more change exports and imports, and thereby the goods market equilibrium. So in case that current account is equal to financial account, then inflow of foreign currency is equal to outflow of foreign currency, and hence demand is equal to supply. We have an equilibrium on the foreign exchange market without any interventions of the central bank, and because we are talking here about flow, inflow and outflow, this relationship is called like flow equilibrium on the foreign exchange market. However, it could be still the case that one country is running a current account surplus and also has the financial account surplus. So one economy might have a flow equilibrium, but in the form of a current account surplus and financial account surplus. So this country would pile up bonds because of the current account surplus. This economy receives bonds from the outside world, and the economy would pile up these bonds like in the cellar of the central bank or in the financial system. One different form of equilibrium is the so-called stock equilibrium. The stock equilibrium is characterized by the situation where the current account is balanced and the financial account is balanced. When the current account is balanced, then the stock of bonds does not change anymore. The stock of bonds is constant. It does not, like this pile of stocks and bonds does not change. It doesn't increase, it doesn't decrease, it is constant. So the level of indebtedness does not change, and therefore we call this relationship stock equilibrium. But also when the current account is balanced, we could look at different scenarios with respect to the sub-balances of the current account. A current account equal to 0 does not imply that also, for example, the trade balance with respect to goods and services is balanced. When you look at some countries, for example, Kazakhstan, it is the case that the whole young generation of Kazakhstan, they are either working in Europe or they are working in the US. They are sending money back home to their parents. Therefore, account number 4 with a secondary income is in a surplus. Afterwards, the parents, which are still living in Kazakhstan, they are going shopping. They are importing goods from abroad so that the trade balance is in a deficit, while the secondary income account is in a surplus. This relationship can also last forever. It is stable as long as the young generation keeps on sending money back home, as long as the account of the secondary income is positive. The elderly generation in Kazakhstan can finance a trade balance deficit. The current account in itself will be balanced. So you can see here that The balance of payment is very interesting to analyze. Despite the fact that the balance of payment is an identity and the balance of payment is always balanced, it makes sense to have a look at the one or the other sub-account. One can see interesting relationships in this sub-balances. So, chapter 13 is an introductory chapter. So we clarified some terms. For example, we distinguished GDP and GNP, production versus income. We also had a look at the goods market equilibrium condition in the form saving and investment, and we were relating it to the current account balance. Furthermore, we also introduced a very important term like the real exchange rate. I think that the real exchange rate is the term which will pop up very frequently in the subsequent lecture. Therefore, the real exchange rate is really an important topic you have to study. Afterwards, we looked at the balance of payment and the different sub-balances, and were able to derive interesting insights into the sub-balances of the balance of payment. Thank you very much for this introductory chapter. Thank you very much for attending this lecture. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.